Propaganda is everywhere. It's a powerful tool used to shape our thoughts, influence our beliefs, and ultimately control our behavior. Whether it's convincing us to buy a product or buy into a narrative, it's embedded in every corner of society. When it comes to narrative type propaganda, it often comes with a fear-based message, giving us a sense of anxiety and a lack of peace. Sometimes we think we've broken free from the matrix because we can see through one form of propaganda, only to find ourselves trapped by another. At the end of the day, propaganda is propaganda, whether it's from a government, a corporate news outlet, an alternative media source, or even just a single individual. But what if you could learn how to easily spot it so that you do not get taken advantage of? By the end of this video, you'll not only understand how propaganda works and shapes society, but also how to see through it and recognize the manipulation at play.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and false
news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
Before we get into why people fall for propaganda and how to see through it, we must understand the human evolutionary reason for why propaganda exists in the first place. Human beings are naturally wired to form groups and trust our group leaders, which is part of why propaganda exists and works so effectively. Evolutionarily speaking, the need to bond with others for mutual survival has ingrained in us an in-group versus out-group mentality. This is something propaganda exploits to rally support for a cause, especially by painting others as a threat, a tactic that has roots in our tribal past. Social identity theory, as proposed by Tajvel, explains how these divisions are created and manipulated to unify people against a perceived enemy. Humans are also predisposed to trust authority figures, a trait that was once essential for group survival. This instinct evolved into trusting leaders and experts in our modern world. Propaganda exploits this by using well-known figures or celebrities as trusted messengers. Studies like the elaboration likelihood model, as proposed by Petty and Kakiopo, show how we are more likely to be persuaded by someone we view as an authority or by someone that we admire without critically questioning the message. On top of that, our brain relies on cognitive shortcuts or heuristics to save mental energy, which can make us more susceptible to persuasive messaging. These shortcuts like availability bias or effective reasoning allow propaganda to bypass our critical thinking and tap directly into our emotions, making us accept information without much scrutiny. Canaham's work shows how these biases shape our decisions. In other words, we don't want to spend so much time researching and trying to figure out the truth for ourselves. We would much prefer to have a shortcut by having somebody give us the information. We like it when people just give us the news, saving us some mental energy. Finally, group cohesion is another evolutionary necessity. Our survival once depended on working together with others, so maintaining unity was critical. Propaganda uses this by fostering a sense of belonging and creating narratives that encourage people to support a common cause, often at the expense of outsiders. The work of Richard Dawkins and E.O. Wilson shows how this group behavior is deeply ingrained in us. In short, propaganda thrives because it taps into our basic instincts, our need for group unity, trust in authority, and reliance on mental shortcuts. These mechanisms were essential for our survival, but today, governments, corporations, and cult leaders use these mechanisms to manipulate and control. Now that we understand why propaganda evolved in human societies, let's get into why in modern day society, people still fall for propaganda. There are 4 psychological mechanisms for why people still fall for propaganda, and then we will look at how a country like the United States uses these 4 psychological mechanisms. One of the primary reasons people fall for propaganda is confirmation bias, which refers to the tendency to favor information that supports our pre-existing beliefs. This bias is powerful because people often seek out sources that reaffirm what they already think. ignoring or dismissing any contradicting evidence. Propagandists know this and craft messages that align with the target audience's worldview, making it easier for them to accept without critically examining it. As social psychologist Leon Festinger pointed out in his work on cognitive dissonance, people prefer information that feels comfortable rather than challenging. This is why propaganda can be so effective. It plays on our need for consistency in our beliefs. Think about it like this. People attach their beliefs to their identity, and their ego is attached to their identity. The ego is focused on survival. So when their beliefs, which are attached to the ego, is threatened, when their beliefs are threatened, the ego sees that as a threat to their survival. So that's why people latch on to this. It's comforting for them. They see it as something that they need in order to survive. But when that is challenged, it's uncomfortable, and they don't want to accept this contradicting information, even if what's contradicting what they believe in might be factual. Propaganda thrives on social influence, particularly the principle of social proof. This is the idea that people are more likely to accept a belief or take an action if they see others doing the same. When we see others, especially respected figures, endorsing a particular idea or narrative, we are more likely to conform. As Dr. Cialdini explains in his book Influence, humans are wired to follow the crowd. Propagandists understand this instinct and use it to their advantage, presenting their message as a widespread belief. Whether it's through celebrities or influencers, social proof can make propaganda seem like the popular or accepted truth. Fear is one of the most powerful emotions that can be used to manipulate us. And propaganda often exploits fear to influence behavior, whether it's the fear of an external enemy, societal collapse, or personal danger. Fear triggers a desire for immediate action, often without questioning the narrative. Psychologist Michael Billing discussed how nationalistic propaganda, for example, uses fear to rally people under a common cause, creating an us versus them mentality. This tactic works because fear reduces our ability to think critically, pushing us to make decisions based on emotion rather than logic. Propagandists exploit this, offering quick solutions to perceived threats, further consolidating control over their audience. I bet you guys have noticed how every 4 years, the campaigns from both sides in the United States or from whatever country you're from uses fear-based tactics to make you fear another candidate that's going to be running for president or prime minister. The next psychological mechanism is about simplification. Humans crave certainty. We prefer clear-cut answers over complex, nuanced truths, which makes propaganda especially effective. When a message reduces a complex issue into black and white terms, it becomes easier to accept and act upon. According to Walter Lippmann's Public Opinion, this desire for simplicity leads people to prefer stories with straightforward narratives that don't require them to engage with complicated information. Propaganda often thrives by reducing issues to simple, emotionally charged messages, making it harder for people to see the full picture. This simplification plays into our natural desire for certainty, making it easier to fall for the manipulation. Now let's get into how the United States uses these 4 psychological mechanisms. So what I'm going to tell you is based on my observations and my thoughts. The US corporations and government officials appear to have an understanding of human psychology. They also understand there are multiple ideologies and different groups of people with different values. This is why lobbyists over the years have made sure that there are only 2 main political parties to pander to 2 major groups of people. And since they fund both major parties, they win either way while giving people a false sense of choice. In other words, although there are multiple different ideologies, these lobbyists appear to try to group whatever falls more into liberals into one major group and whatever falls into more conservative leaning into one major group. With confirmation bias, these lobbyists who not only fund both major parties, but also all major mainstream news outlets, make sure to have outlets that will pander to those who have values that will lean towards being liberal or conservative. With social proof and peer pressure, they make sure there are only 2 main factions presented in the mainstream and pandering to the masses so that the groups are as large as possible. If there was only one narrative, it would be harder to control the masses without a more obvious authoritative appearance. which would cause people to question, fear, or rebel after a history of making us think we live in a true democracy that values different perspectives. Also, if we had more than two factions, it would be too chaotic for the government and lobbyists to manage. This is why third parties are so suppressed through elections and mainstream conversations, in addition to being so small and unorganized. After Bernie Sanders in 2016 raised more awareness about the corruption within the Democratic Party, narratives in the mainstream and alternative sources quickly fought to reprogram these supporters either back into supporting Democrats or Republicans by mainly criticizing one side over the other instead of exposing how they are both two sides of the same coin. Many alternative news sources who criticize the US unfortunately still fall for the lesser of two evils mentality by mainly criticizing one side over the other instead of exposing the power that controls both. These groups of people with shared or similar ideologies shame or peer pressure one another into believing in the same narrative. If they do not repeat the same narrative as their peers, then they are told they are helping the other side win. This also ties in with emotional manipulation, in which we see each major news outlet instigating their audience to fear the other side. And if it's not to fear other Americans for having different beliefs, these outlets try to program us into fearing immigrants or to fear other countries to manufacture consent for international intervention. Lastly, with simplification and the need for certainty, the US attempts to program people into believing certain authority figures just because they are seen as official, or news outlets just because they are seen as official or credible news outlets. But also when governmental agencies say something is true, we are made to believe we cannot question it because it is the official governmental agency like the FDA or the CDC, or an individual in a position like Secretary of State. Just because they are pushed to be seen as official doesn't mean they have not been wrong before. This also doesn't mean they will always be wrong, however. The truth will be in the nuance. We just have to look at the evidence to make sure their claims are accurate, rather than unquestionably believing what they say. Even when you listen to alternative outlets, we must look at the evidence instead of just believing everything they say. Now, this is just with the United States, so we must also consider that other countries and governments have their ways of propagandizing their people by using different strategies and tactics, depending on their current way of how they govern their people, as well as the history of their country or government. With that out of the way, let's get into how you can see through propaganda. How can you lift your awareness to prevent yourself from being manipulated by people who are pushing propaganda? One of the best defenses against propaganda is to, number one, develop strong critical thinking skills. This means questioning the information you receive, analyzing its sources, and looking for any biases or hidden agendas behind it. Critical thinking isn't just about doubting everything, because that would just make you cynical. It's about assessing evidence, recognizing logical fallacies, and being aware of how language can be used to manipulate emotions. By sharpening your ability to think critically, you'll be better equipped to see through the narratives being pushed on you, whether they come from media outlets, advertisers, or even social media influencers and news commentators. Remember, the goal isn't to reject all information, but to evaluate it with a discerning eye. Not only must you be aware of others' biases, but you also have to be aware of your own and acknowledge the possibility that you could be wrong. Propaganda often targets our emotions, using fear, anger, or even hope to influence our thoughts and actions. So for number two, you must develop emotional awareness. Becoming aware of your emotional triggers can help you recognize when someone is trying to manipulate you. For example, if a news story or a social media post is making you feel a strong emotional reaction, take a step back and question why. Are they trying to scare you, guilt you, or rally you behind a cause? Understanding your own emotional responses can act as a filter, allowing you to see past emotional manipulation and focus on the facts. By cultivating emotional intelligence, you not only protect yourself from being easily swayed, but also gain a clearer perspective on what's truly important. Knowledge is power when it comes to resisting propaganda. So number three is educate yourself. Educate yourself on history, media tactics, and the ways in which propaganda has been used in the past to shape public opinion. The more you understand how these techniques work, the easier it will be for you to spot them in action. This doesn't necessarily mean you need to become an expert, but being well read on topics like logical fallacies, persuasion tactics, and the history of propaganda can make you less vulnerable to manipulation. When you know how propaganda operates, you become a more informed person, capable of making decisions based on truth rather than manipulation. Another way to see through propaganda is to, number 4, engage in open dialogue with others and maintain a healthy level of skepticism. This doesn't mean being cynical or dismissing everything as fake news, but rather questioning information and discussing it with a variety of perspectives. When you talk to people who have different viewpoints, you can uncover biases you might not have seen on your own. Healthy skepticism means asking the right questions. Who benefits from this message? What's the evidence? Why is this being presented in a certain way? By fostering open conversation and critical inquiry, you can break through the echo chambers and see the bigger picture. Last but certainly not least, because I've been saying this for years, if you've been subscribed to this channel for a long time, and if you're new, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. What I have been saying is to, number 5, diversify your sources. Do not just listen to one outlet or similar outlets who all repeat the same information. Do not only listen to mainstream news. Do not only listen to one government-sponsored news from one country. Look at multiple outlets. Look at the evidence being presented. How do these different narratives conflict? Keyword, narrative. Again, this requires you to be aware of biases and to separate facts from opinions. Separate the facts from the narrative. Certain opinions and biases will motivate people to only present information that is convenient for the news presenter's ego, creating a narrative. Look for the evidence, and I would advise to not waste so much time listening to narratively focused outlets, whether they are mainstream or alternative. If you could get the same information from other sources that present that information in a more valuable way with more nuance and evidence, you would be saving yourself a lot of wasted time and prevent yourself from being manipulated by someone's biases and selfish gains. If you want to see through propaganda, you can remember these 5 points as a guide, but you must also be aware of how social media algorithms try to fuel your addictions and place you in echo chambers. There is a way to see through that and use these social media algorithms to your advantage. So for more information on that, check out this video right here. Thanks for watching.